Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for showing up to this event. I realize we're competing against another exciting one next door, so your attendance is much appreciated, and hopefully it's going to be worthwhile for you. So today, I'm going to talk about the approach that we have to protecting data at Code42. My name is Paul Martin. I head up pre-sales systems engineering here in the UK, and I'm just giving you the thoughts and the conversations and some of the things that we've found when we've talked to customers and prospects alike. The thing that we focus on specifically is the data. The gentleman before mentioned about zero trust, and that is one of the core tenets of zero trust, is to protect data, identity and network being the other things on there. So we definitely subscribe to that. And what we're specifically aiming ourselves at is a particular problem with data that sits on the endpoint and sits in the cloud and sits outside of our perimeter for all intents and purposes. And traditional DLP, certainly from my perspective and the conversations I've had, hasn't able to keep up to protect against this particular threat. So this is pretty much what we're going to talk about today. Focusing on the insider threat. I'm going to focus on a specific use case because we're very short of time. Some of the sessions in here will have to zero into very specific things, whereas we protect against more general things. If you want a longer conversation about insider threat, we're available downstairs to, again, talk about that. So it's on the rise, and this is pretty much one of the things that we've seen in recent years, and this is for a number of reasons. I don't want to get into too much detail here, but it's just in general the way people work. People share a lot of data these days, whereas maybe in times gone by, centralized infrastructures, things like Citrix, where we've secured everything and everything sits inside the perimeter, the files all sit inside the perimeter, the profile is centrally managed. You can't really break out of the device and copy data that way, but that has changed. And cloud technologies in there allow people to save data up to the cloud, allow people to share within our own organizations, but also B2B and share with other people. And also there's a concept of mirror IT in there as well, because we have, say, OneDrive for our business requirement, but people also have their own personal OneDrive accounts as well. And again, the challenge is telling the difference in activity between the two, because that's really important. But the key thing here is that, the largest, one of the largest players in the market, again, has struggled with this last year. And this is not to sort of poke fun or anything else like that, because this is never nice when it happens. But there are good reasons that this particularly failed, and that is, there are exceptions to the rule. When you have policies in place, you can block USB, but people might need it for business purposes. You can block access to certain cloud-based services, but again, people are going to need exceptions to that rule. And in that case, what do you do? On this particular one, these former employees from McAfee went to Tanium. Now, they solve two different problems, in my view. And there might be a little bit of crossover between the technologies, but unfortunately, that's not how the lawyers actually see it. So again, this wasn't particularly sophisticated in terms of attack. Again, things were copied onto thumb drives, copied via email, and this wasn't actually discovered. And even when it was discovered, it was only discovered by accident. And by then, the damage from that perspective had pretty much already been done. But pricing information, marketing plans, those kinds of things. This is not regulated data. This is not PII, PCI. It's not protected in the same kind of way, but it's still just as valuable. And when people leave, this is what they do. They take data. We have a solution, obviously, for this. And when we pointed this, when we were developing it, we pointed it out to our engineering team. It was a blind test. And we identified 100% of the people that were actually going to leave within 2 weeks very accurately. And they all have some things in common. They touch data a lot. They move a lot of files. They also delete a lot of files. Now, that in itself isn't necessarily malicious, because when people hand back laptops, they tend to clear things like iTunes libraries and photographs and things like that. That's just standard. But again, being able to see that is a good indicator that someone is actually going to leave. It's not necessarily an indicator of compromise on the device, but it's certainly an indicator that somebody is up to something. Either they're going to change their laptop, they're going to change their device, but this thing's going back to IT, and they want to make sure that all their data is off it. And people do this. I mean, I think it's the millennial generation, when they create data, it's very common for them to associate the creation of that data with the ownership of that data. And that's not necessarily the case. But a lot of people feel entitled to actually take data when they leave. And they do it for all sorts of reasons to give themselves a leg up in their next company. So it's not just people taking data that you should be worried about. It's if you're hiring someone from a competitor, what are they bringing inside to your environment? What are they bringing inside and putting on your servers? And does that leave you exposed just as much as people taking data does? And in some cases, the answer to that can be yes. So we know all about this. There are many vectors. I'm not going to spend time on this, but again, it's very hard for security teams to keep up, especially when there are legitimate business reasons for actually using some of these solutions out there, even things like USB. One of the largest mobile deployments in the world is IBM, but they still have many, many thousands of exceptions to that particular policy for their mobile users. And tracking that becomes difficult. But even the people that are supposed to be blocked from USB are still using USB because sometimes the policy can't be enforced properly or for whatever reason. And there are ways to circumvent it as well. A few dollars. You can buy a rubber ducky USB and you can plug that in there. It won't look like a USB stick to anything that's trying to protect and block against that. So that's going to be an issue for you. So again, I've talked a little bit about that just for time. I'm just going to move on here. And what we're going to talk about is the DLP product lifecycle. A lot of people have invested time and money in DLP, and I'm not saying you should throw it all away. That's certainly not my intention here. I'm just saying that it's not going to solve all of your problems. And for a number of reasons. Some organizations do have sophisticated security teams. They can cope with this. They can classify data. If you can't classify data, then deploying policy is going to be very difficult to that data. But at best, around about 85% is probably the best you can hope for, and that's only if you start classifying data from day one. If you're trying to retrofit classification to your data, that's going to be much more difficult. And what actually happens after that is that we rely on the data owners to actually classify the data properly at that particular point. Now that ends up usually being the end users of that data, and they need training on how to do that. And if that's lacking, then again, this 85% figure is going to dwindle. Okay? And it's a continuous process. This is not the case of, I've got a classification project, and once I've done it, that's it. Hooray, we can all go home. You need to keep on doing this. It's done forever and ever. And also, the kind of data you want to protect today may differ from what you need to protect, say, next month and further on down the line. But you have to have that in process for policy to work. Okay? And policy is dependent on some accuracy, some degree of accuracy in the classification. And the thing about policy is it will only look at what you tell it to look at. There are many different ways to obfuscate data if you want to take it. And there are many different ways to manipulate it to get it out of the environment. I mean, I've talked to customers that had email systems say, yeah, we block all social security numbers. Talk to the end users and they, yeah, we just add an X to the end of the social security number so we can get it through the email filter. Those are the kinds of things that can happen. And again, policy will only look at what you tell it to look at. It can be circumvented. And as I mentioned before, keeping up with all the different solutions that we have there, the shadow IT, the mirror IT, they're always threats. These are things that we have to look at. So when someone gets DLP in place, it's usually, it's not a quick process. I think at a minimum, you'll be sold consultancy services to actually get this up and running. The process is probably going to be something like 30, 60, 90 before you can actually start using the solution. And again, that's the kind of thing that I've seen with a lot of customers and prospects that I talk to. And they start off with actually blocking certain things that are of interest. USB is an easy one. A lot of people will block that, not necessarily because they're worried about exfiltration, but what's somebody bringing into the environment that's nasty from a malware perspective. And again, it does make sense to actually do that. But all the other services that you've got there, cloud-based services, websites, all those different kinds of things that people use, that maybe they need to do their job. Again, does blocking work? Is that the appropriate response for the action that's been taken? Sometimes it isn't. So when the users all kick back and say, right, well, this is stopping me from doing my job, my DLP solution is not in blocking mode anymore, it's in monitor mode. Okay, so now my users can work, so that's one roadblock from them. They're now more efficient, they're happy. However, my admin team aren't so happy anymore because they're getting a lot of false positives. And they've got to wade through all these different alerts that I've set up for USB access. Not all of it's going to be malicious, but I've still got to look at every single one of them anyway. And ultimately, this is the last part of it, which is an absolute tragedy, is we just end up ignoring most of the events that are generated because there's just too much there. There's too much data. We're swimming in it. We can't actually deal with it. So this is what Code42 is all about. We're pretty much going to throw a blanket over all of the data on endpoints specifically, just to make that particular point. And we don't need classification. We will capture a lot of events. This can sort of number in the millions, and that sounds like an awful lot. Sounds like just the problem I was just talking about. But much in the same way as I go to google.com, I'm not going to go to every single website till I find the one that I want. There are going to be a rich set of tools that allow me to zero in on the things that I'm interested in, the things that I'm going to find more interesting. And again, we provide what are called lenses to actually do that for us. So we can trim down all of these different file system events and give you the stuff that we think you should look at. And one of the lenses that I'm going to show you in a minute is the departing employee lens. Now, departing employee is an interesting one because I also ask the customers and prospects that I deal with, what's the offboarding process? What do you do when someone hands in their notice? And they'll say, yeah, we get their phone back, we get the laptop back. We disable their account inside AD, and that's plugged into all these other different systems. We get the badge back. Okay, but what about the data? Well, we put them into extra monitoring mode after they've handed in their resignation letter. Thing is, if I was going to take data, I wouldn't take it on the day that I handed in my resignation because I know all this kind of stuff is going to happen. I would take it 30 days ago, 60 days ago, possibly even longer. And that's what most people do. So they've already got the data. The key thing here is how do you identify those users up front. So let me just break out of this for a second. And hopefully we can see this. So the main dashboard is risk exposure. Again, that's something that I can just look at from time to time to see if, hey, is there anything funny going on there? The kind of things that I'd be looking for there would be a large number of files and a low number of users, and that allows me to look at something very specific, which is the user activity that's based upon that. So we can see that somebody has copied files to browser or other application. There's 53 events. There's only 4 users. And if I click on the number of users, then I should be able to say, well, Sean's been busy. Sean's copied 47 of these files to cloud-based services. So now I can zero in on that if I want to using this hourglass. And I can see what those files are. Now in the background, we're capturing an awful lot of metadata that's associated with these events, but metadata on its own is largely uninteresting to me because unless, it's a bit like a fingerprint at a crime scene. On its own, a fingerprint, not very good. Unless you can attach it to a body or a suspect, then it's just a fingerprint. But if I can get access to the file that goes with this, then that's different. That actually helps me. So you can see that we keep an awful lot of metadata. We've got the fingerprint of the file here. We've got the public IP address. We have the timestamp, so we know roughly where and when this actually happened. We know the user that performed the action. We also have the device name of the action that they took this on as well. We capture all sorts of other things for the sort of tech people in the room. We attach this to the process. We capture a lot of details about the window that was actually used there as well. Okay, somebody didn't like what I had to say. But this can be quite useful because this allows me to figure out roughly what were they using, where did it go to. And for example, if we do use, we're a Google Drive house, and my personal Gmail account pops up in there, I know that's something that I have to look at. So we also have the concept in here of trusted domains, things that we can safely ignore because that is work-related stuff, whereas everything else is not. But as I mentioned, the thing here that I'm really interested in is to get access to that file. And we can download that pretty much straight away. So this one is team retreat planning notes. Someone's copied this to Google Drive somewhere. I just want to see what's on there to see if it is sensitive or not. Okay. And somebody doesn't want to go to Vegas this year for our kickoff. Can't imagine why. Okay. But again, being able to see inside the files is quite useful. And we can do that on a per user basis. But again, as I mentioned before, the key thing here is to have that customized view, that lens, based on the use case that we've got here. Now, we will be adding to this in the course of 2020, so things like suspicious users, MIME type mismatch, things that we can gather today, but we have to do a little bit more manual work around that. But that will be built into these lenses, built into these dashboards, so you don't really need a high degree of sophistication or expertise to actually use this. That's the whole point of it. This is one of these things that's designed to be easy to use. The last thing as a security team you need is something that generates a bucket load more alerts. And again, that's not what we're about at all. So we can set up stuff that's a bit more proactive than that. We can have rules, and then when the rules are broken, obviously they trigger an alert. Those alerts can be sent to whoever needs to see them. It doesn't necessarily have to be security teams all the time. You can send these direct to data owners. So for example, if somebody has the permission to copy stuff to Dropbox because they're giving stuff to another organization, then that's fine. We can do that. We can say pretty much in an instant, well, actually, this individual does have rights to do that. We can exclude those guys from monitoring if we need to. And then the alerts are pretty much easy to read. We're not giving you a bunch of technical detail in here. Again, it's just a case of giving you the high-level overview, some activity and removable media. The number of files is 4. They were zip files. For me, I'd be looking at zip files going, that's interesting. I definitely want to see what's inside there. And indeed, one of the use cases, one of our customers is a company called CrowdStrike. And they're really good at what they do. And we're customers of theirs as well, funnily enough. And we can use those solutions for monitoring what actually happens on the network. And they obviously can do the same. But they had a situation last year where one of their developers was using something like this. They were using the zip process to copy files, code files, and exfiltrate them and take them out of the business. When they intercepted one of these files, because that's one of the nice things you can do with CrowdStrike, they found it was password protected. Again, not really helpful because they weren't actually able to prove anything. They couldn't get it open. And that's where Code42 came in, because one of the things that we can do here, we have another feature in here which underpins this called forensic search. I can look for those files, and we capture all of the data that goes with that. So every version of every file that goes in there, every deleted file, we've got it. We've got the metadata that's associated with it. So from an investigation standpoint, that's going to be quite useful. And in real time as well, we can alert on people actually taking data, doing stupid things, raising permissions of files inside file shares. And I put my hand up to this because things like Google Drive, I wanted to share a file with about 15 different team members. I didn't really want to type in 15 different email addresses, so I decided to share this file with everyone at Code42. I had a phone call a few minutes later from an IT guy back in the US going, did you really mean to do that? And I says, well, yeah, it's only everybody inside Code42. He goes, no, it's public. It's anyone with a link. And this is IP, and you shouldn't really be doing that. Oops. So I go back in and change that. And I'm supposed to be technical, but this kind of thing happens to the best of us. And again, but at least we give you the visibility to actually see that and rectify that. So getting back to our CrowdStrike example, again, this is one of the other queries that they had set up, so they were able to see if anybody was copying stuff, say from Bitbucket to via WinZip, pushing all this stuff via email, for example, or Dropbox or whatever it is. We've got that whole file lifecycle in there from the day and hour that this thing is installed. It will actually look and see what files are installed locally. We can see what actually happens to those files. What is the journey of that file onto and off that system? Where does it go to? What applications touched it? And again, things like tying it to stuff like WinZip or any other compression tool that you've got in there, we can do. And again, some of the things that our customers are worried about is, well, there are many different types of application out there. Slack, for example, doesn't necessarily have to go internally. That can go business to external, and that worries us a little bit. Can you do something with that? Teams as well, again, another kind of application that can do that, and who knows what's going to be next week. But if you can tie that action to the process, you're actually able to see what applications are performing these actions on behalf of these users, obviously user-initiated. Okay. So I'm just going to drop out of the demo for a second. Get back to this. So just in summary, I mean, this is what we do at Code42. I mean, we are focused on endpoints, and we're focused on where data lives. So this also means that we can look at your corporate instance of OneDrive, G Drive. We can also look at Office 365 email. We're adding support for other applications in there as we go on. So things like Slack and Teams are imminently on the roadmap, and that allows you to plug into those cloud data sources and give you that unified picture of that user's data footprint. What are they doing with this data? Whether it's on the endpoint, whether it lives in the cloud, we're able to see pretty much all of that. And again, we can do this in pretty much near real time. So anybody that makes a change, we're not reliant on if we have to go and collect the data that the device is actually switched on. If you need to go back and say, what was this individual doing yesterday, for example, they may have lost this device, they may have left the company, the device might be broken, the hard disk might have went popped, it could have been hit by ransomware, all sorts of things could have happened to it. But when we actually go in and we want to grab that particular file, we've got it already. Because we don't discriminate, we don't care too much about say the classification of files, because we're grabbing everything. We're not reliant on pointing at something and looking at a particular subset of files. We're going to grab everything, and that allows you to go and search for whatever it is that you want to search for. Again, so it could be anything. It could be a zip file that you thought was rather innocuous. You might not have a policy to actually block those kinds of things. But if you find that a particular individual has been taking stuff via that vector, then it's a good idea to go back in and have a look at that history and see what else they've taken. So, I mean, just don't take my word for it. We've got a number of customers. I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but as you'd expect, the CrowdStrike reference is the one that I've already mentioned. But we have thousands of customers across the board doing this today, and we protect some of the largest, say, mobile workforces on the planet as well. And again, we do this to great effect. So, in my point of view, there is a better way. Protect all the data where it lives, so on the endpoint in the cloud. Again, if you can do away with classification and policies for this particular use case, then that's great, because that's going to give you that faster time to value. We're not looking at 30, 60, 90 or longer to actually get this up and running and start delivering value. It's pretty much going to do it from the day and hour that we're deployed on all the systems and we start gathering that data. And then with the lenses that we've got, we're able to reduce the amount of data that you actually see and just highlight the stuff, bubble up the stuff to you that we think is going to be most important. Again, the kinds of things that we're interested in here are people working abnormal hours, for example. If somebody's working Monday through Friday and they work Sunday evenings, for me, that's normal hours. So copying a lot of data in the Sunday evening might not necessarily be the thing that I want to be highlighted. But if they do a lot of stuff on, say, Saturday afternoon, for example, or if they do it really early on a Monday morning, then those kinds of things might be bubbled up to me. So again, it's just all about getting the data, but getting it in context as well. And again, just reducing the amount of false positives that admins have to deal with. Trying to eliminate as much of that as possible. There's already enough to deal with from all the other cyber systems that we have in place. The last thing we need is something adding to that particular burden, in which case, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to eliminate that. We're trying to help in that particular instance. And the last thing here, security is all about the data, obviously, but it's all about the users as well. And you have to take them with you. This is not about blocking people. This is not about stopping them doing this, stopping them doing that. We should be enabling them to do their job. And collaboration is the way that most organizations want to work these days. There are big benefits of collaboration, and indeed our company is a collaborative company. We don't block anything on here. I don't block USB. Betting websites, as I found out the other day, they are blocked. But everything else is not blocked, and I can use things like Dropbox, but I will be monitored. And if anything looks suspicious to the security team, I can guarantee I'll get a phone call within a few minutes. But that's a lot less friction than me copying a lot of data to somewhere and then the device being locked out of it, being kicked out of the device, and then having to wait, say, maybe 3-4 hours to actually get back in there. That can be very stressful for someone like me with my job, especially with customers and end users to deal with. That just wouldn't work. And again, most people find that is the case as well. So that's pretty much all that I had. And I just want to say thank you again for turning up in sort of quite big numbers as well. So I'm much appreciated for that. But yeah, I think I've got a couple of minutes left for questions. If you don't feel comfortable asking questions in here, bear in mind we're downstairs as well. More than happy to have a one-to-one conversation. We can have that over lunch or after lunch. Thank you.